Hello there. Phew, boy, you know, the 20th century. I watched I just watched my videos from yesterday, and it all sounds so dreary. I think it's honest. There were good things that happened. There were lots of really good things that happened in the 20th century. And you know what? When I get to the classics, that's what I'm really about. What do we have that we still value? Those are the classics. And we have a lot that came out of the 20th century that we highly value. But I tried to give you some historical background, and what I want to do today is try to, you know, what I've done with each of these periods lately is giving you some history and characteristics. What were people like that they not different from, say, other times or now? And I'm going to give this a shot. Well, this is the 11th period, I believe. It's the 20th century, you know, from about 1920, for my purposes, from about 1920 up to about 1990. And I'm going to separate it. But before I go on to this, one more extremely dreary figure. I looked this up. You know, I thought, you know, I said I'm going to the 1990s. This is history. Well, by that time, it was apparent that the world had a disease called AIDS. It was about 1980, a little after 1980, I think, that it became widely known. And, you know, I guess I want to say in its quiet way, it has killed, I mean, 30 million is how many people, was the estimate that I saw, have died because of AIDS since 1980. I mean, that puts it right up there beyond the casualties of World War I. So, you know, staggering. So, you know, although since it's not a war and it's not quite so open and it's in the poorer parts of the country, the world, it's not so obvious maybe, but it needs to be mentioned, I think. You know, many other things of major historical importance needed to be mentioned, but that's the nature of this course. All right, characteristics. Well, the 1920s, they have the nickname of the Roaring Twenties. They were wild. There was an attitude of get rich quick. I don't know to what extent that was true in Europe. I'm not sure. My perspective is, you know, very much an American perspective. You know, I explain it a little bit by saying if you understand what the Victorians were like, women always with long hair that they could put up, hemlines all the way down to the floor, necklines like this, sleeves the whole way down, very proper. And if you just go to the opposite, there I think you can get to 1920s. It's one of those cases where there's this real big swing. And I sometimes wonder what in the world men thought, older men around 1920, because now women could actually be on a beach in a bathing suit. You could actually not only see a woman's ankles, you could see a woman's knees. Women cut their hair short, they bobbed their hair. There's a nickname for such women, they were called flappers, which doesn't necessarily mean that they were women of low morals. It was stylish women of the time. They smoked cigarettes in public, they danced the Charleston. And, you know, some explanation of how this happened comes from the fact, here in America, comes from the fact that American young men had been in Europe, and they had encountered things in Europe that were very different from the United States. The United States, by comparison, was a more conservative place, and they brought some of those ideas back. That's probably true. There was also a population shift that occurred in the 1920s. Before that, by far, most Americans lived on farms out in the countryside, but that shift began where now most Americans by far live in cities, and I suppose that was worldwide too. And then consumerism, you know, I saved this to box that, because if I have to come up with one single characteristic of the 20th century, there's what I end up coming up with. Why I put it here with the 1920s is because here was sort of the beginning of mass advertising. And people began to consume things, not because they needed them, but because they had been taught to want them. things that never before had really been thought of as necessary. But now advertising was driving this desire to consume things more than what you actually need. And really you can see it starting in a big time in the 1920s. Partly the consumer goods, as I suggested, I think yesterday, that the factories geared up to make war material, I think you call it, now started to crank out electric stoves and electric refrigerators and electric toasters and many other things. Well, of course, that came to an abrupt end, the Roaring '20s. And we go into the Depression years of the 1930s. Now, I say dreary. There's the word that comes to my mind the quickest. When you see film footage or photographs of the 1930s, people look dreary. Those were hard times. But at the same time, people tended to be utopian. A utopianism began to grow. And when I mention classics, I'll take a little bit more time over the last 3 days than I will today. But when I talk about classics of the time, you're going to be able to see that. When things got rough, people began to dream, to fantasize about more perfect worlds. It has to be better. And so utopianism, that idea of a better world, you can see it evident in the 1930s. The 1940s, I think people tended to be patriotic. I guess it's kind of ironic that I would be wearing a khaki color here, but when a country is at war, a country usually becomes patriotic. And, you know, what it was called in America, the war effort, and entertaining the troops and all that. And generations from each one of these times get stamped, in a sense, by that time. My father, for example, that generation, his generation, they tended to keep that through life, this patriotism that they have. You get to the 1950s, and once again we've got this consumerism. In the 1950s, I mean, the automobile, see, that was something that started in the 1920s. People could actually have an automobile, and this idea of taking 2-week vacations and wearing Bermuda shorts and living in suburbs. You know, I just think of it as consumerism comes back strong. But there was that Cold War in the background, always that feeling of dread. And by the time you get to the 1960s, there's the time that has stamped me. I can't deny it. I am a product of the 1960s, more so probably than any other time. My students in the public school, they used to so much want me to be a hippie. They wanted to say, oh, you're a hippie. No, I don't think so. I don't think I ever really qualified as a hippie, but I was marked. The 1960s, there were young people, they rebelled. They were not happy about the world that they were living in. They were not happy about that fear that they had all the time. They got angry about Vietnam and other injustices in the world. I should have put down, they were rebellious, but they were also idealistic, you know, utopian. I'll get to that too, but they were also very idealistic. And I think that's something that is often left out when people want to think about the hippies and the people in the 1960s. It's easy to look at them as sort of, oh, yeah, funny, on drugs and not in their right mind. And it's a little hard to see the idealism that was there, but it was there. Let me go back to the rebelliousness. The business of letting your hair grow, like the hippies did, that was rebellious against the 1940s generation. You know, there was a war going on in the 1960s, the war in Vietnam, but the nation was not patriotic. The nation was divided because so many, especially young people, thought it was wrong. So you have here one generation, very patriotic, coming out of World War II, another generation, angry. And there was a nickname, it was called the Generation Gap that occurred there. It would have been between myself and my father. Although my father and I usually got along pretty well through that, but many were not so lucky there. The utopianism, you could see that in the communes. young people wanted to experiment, and the idealism. I'll talk about that. Well, even drugs I should put in here. In the early part, in the early times, that was part of that utopianism, I think. The idealism, I think I'll deal with that tomorrow or the next day when I talk about the legacy. The classics that we have. What do we have from that time? And I maintain that the 1960s did a lot to shape modern day thinking, and I'll try to support that tomorrow. You get to the 1970s and it begins at this point to get harder for me to explain. I think of it as nostalgic, a little bit looking back at the 50s. Those were the good old times. In the 1960s, there were 4 major assassinations. The president had been assassinated, and others, and there was all this rebelliousness. And then we get, and there was the punk was a kind of an attitude and a way of dressing and all that. I don't understand it well. I'll just admit that. And by the time we get to the 1980s, my take on it, again, I'm stamped by the 1960s. My take on it is consumerism was often running again. You see, in the 1970s, there was the Arab oil embargo, where for a while people began to think about the fact that, gee, maybe oil wasn't unlimited, maybe cars should be smaller. But then, once that passed and we get into the 1980s, it was a great disappointment to me, frankly, because I shared, and still share, a lot of the idealism of the 1960s. And when I, some of that thing, like the environment, when I saw some of my own, friends and relatives and people who had thought like me, who had embraced some of the ideals of the 1960s, it seemed to me I just saw them let it go. And they decided, oh well, we might as well be rich. We might as well enjoy it. I have to be careful here, because I can so much give you my view of it, but I did live it, and that is me. So the consumerism was back and going. Why I say open about sex is because by now the age became apparent, and I remember in the schools it actually was a matter of law that the schools had to talk to their students about things like oral sex and anal sex, and before that, and homosexuality. You didn't talk about that at all in school. You could get in deep trouble, and now almost by law you had to, for the protection of the young people, and that resulted in a kind of a more openness in general. That's why that's there. And I guess one other thing I should say maybe against this background is the extreme rise in world population. You could regard it as one of the very good things, if you wanted to, of the 20th century, the agricultural revolution with fertilizers to make food more widely available. But the result also was that the population increased dramatically. And here we are now with a very, I'm jumping now into the present, which I said I wouldn't do, but the groundwork has been laid. Now we've got a very much bigger population, and this consumerism has not gone away. I mean, the world is full of people who really want to live like it was possible for a while for Americans and Europeans to live with this consumerism. But how much can the planet stand? And one other thing, just in case I wouldn't mention it any other way, if you wanted to have a measure of this, I maintain that you can kilocalories. You can measure it in kilocalories, just better than dollars or euros. Or if you would measure the amount of kilocalories, that is a unit of energy that a typical modern day person consumes, there you can get a real clear measure of a dramatic change. Well, I keep sort of coming back to dreary stuff, but the last 3 days we only have 3 days left. I'm going to talk about what we have that we value, so I'll see you tomorrow.